This Choircast podcast is brought to you in part by the Liminal Living Podcast. Liminal, the word 1,000 miles wide but small enough to fit into the present moment. It describes an in-between place. We live most of our lives within this space, not quite ever arriving at our idealistic final destination. We spend so much of our energies on our best impersonation of who we wish we were, until we can't. But in sneaks a dark night of the soul, or perhaps a mystical experience. Our way of being has an error loop introduced. Today we call that deconstruction. Welcome to the Liminal Living Podcast, where we teach you how to be here, how to traverse these spaces, and where we can go if we remain humble, open, and honest.
I feel like you should start by saying like, "Oh, yeah."
Oh, yeah.
Do you have a trademark on that?
I don't. You know what's funny is I didn't even know that I say it all the time. And one of my former youth said, was listen to the podcast. Some topic came up and she clicked and was listening. She goes, "So you talk about nerdy stuff in youth minister mode, or is that just how you actually adult?" That was what a 24-year-old asked me. Oh, yeah. And she said that when I first got to Los Angeles, I said, "Aw, junk." And they were like, "That's not cool here. And we made you quit saying aw, junk." And I guess she's like,
"This
is
have
what
someone that's following you, letting you know what's cool and not cool." I mean, I need a few people like that in my life.
Well, don't you think like at a certain age, when your kids get to a certain age, attempting to be cool is no longer cool.
No.
So then you just have to embrace. I try to like embrace 20% of my life is stuff that provokes eye rolls from my children.
Yeah.
So you give off that dad vibe.
Yeah.
So like maybe 1 out of every 10 times you're in a car, if someone rolls down the window, you roll them all down and turn on some 90s rap music and just start singing along. And they're like, "Why is this happening?"
Yeah.
And you're like, "I thought we were having fun."
Right. And 20%, that's pretty good percentage. I mean, some days you're going to go way above that. Other days, way below. But I'm a big fan of that. My kids are a little bit older and it's still happening. Here's my thing about dad jokes, though. I try to tell my boys, just because I'm funny and I'm a dad does not mean that you can relegate all my stuff to dad joke status. Like, no, some of this stuff is more nuanced. You got to give me credit, man.
Yeah. I don't know. And I've met a lot of dads.
Yeah.
And I think we're both easily in the top half.
of dads or jokes or both.
Oh, I'm gonna put my jokes in the top third because I know some dads, they feel like they get old, they can't even be funny anymore.
Right. You got to trying.
And you got to go context for your jokes. So if you're dealing with my 7-year-old Haven, just fit poop in there. If you can fit a variation of an excrement in, it's funny.
Right.
It's funny. Yep. Cora, on the other hand, she's like on that age, like, oh, I'm going into 5th grade. Some of my friends are trying to like learn how to do makeup on YouTube and be hip and stuff. So you can't make jokes for the 7-year-old for her. You got to level it up again.
Right.
But if you make a joke and there's any Taylor Swift reference, even if it's wrong, you get partial credit, right? She's like, "It's okay, Dad. No, that's on 1984. Well, that's in the folklore era." And I'm like, "All right, Cora." And my oldest, he's 16, he just got his driver's license. And I've noticed that since he's thinking about my need to get his car insurance, and he really would like an automobile that's not dependent on mom or I being free, he laughs at everything. So this is like crazy. Nice. He just enjoys it all. He just enjoys it all.
Yeah, that's creative. That's a good dad move right there. And you miss all the shots you don't take. So you got to go for some of these jokes. Yeah.
Yeah.
Well,
Praise
okay. Right on. Welcome everybody to the show. My name's Jonathan. Last name is Foster. Middle name is Underscore. How handy has it been for my parents to give me that middle name? I could commodify it for Substack, for social media. Although I got kicked off Facebook. I don't know if you know that, but I am.
You did?
Yeah, suspended permanently is what Meta has been telling me.
What did you do?
I'm not really sure. I mean, I have a percentage of my friends who think, it's conspiratorial, and they're like, you said too many progressive things. And I obviously, like you, I mean, you have more than me, but lots of conservative pushback at times. And I will say that my last day on, about a month ago, I got some really radical, fundamentalist types telling me how great of a Christian they were, but also telling me how much they were going to make my life miserable. So that could be it. But
Are you
yeah,
in like some process of hearing about it?
I'm trying to appeal. Like it's weird. There's nothing you can
Here's my
really do.
advice on this. Unsolicited, though, I have multiple friends that have had your problem.
Okay.
If someone comes on your Facebook and
Yeah.
you don't eventually want to get reported and they say crazy stuff, block them and every account that they have.
Yep.
One, you don't want to run an ad that actually thinks it's getting energy because this person called you, a heretic or you're going to hell. Second, they're the ones who this is the few times I've had issues with Facebook. It's because some ad or some post gets into this fundamentalist group. They share it in a million things and they all go report you. So just block them and all the pages they're associated with.
Yep.
And then people leave you message like, why is there 100 comments? I can only see 15. And I'm like, because it got shared to like NRA for Jesus in America Facebook group and they all came over. And screenshot any of the craziest ones and use that if they follow up with you and they're like, the algorithm said this, blah, 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 blah. You're like, yeah, I started blocking people when someone posted my address on here. What do you want to do about it? Y'all, did your algorithm notice they put my home address on here? And then they're like, oh, okay, well, you're back.
Yeah.
And that's my theory. It's to use the social media well, you have to make sure it's not a public square because we're humans. We don't know how to do that well, apparently. I would like it if there was social media where you had to like you could opt in only to interact with people who their profiles are attached to their ID.
Mm-hmm.
I think that would be great.
Yep.
I know there's some people like reporters, anonymous people, or some people that are like in sketchy situations and like don't want to go. That's fine. The internet has plenty of places for that. But just you have to make rules on the internet for what the recently retired boomer, how it impacts their conspiracy thinking, and a large number of bots disappearing, and no one getting to say what they say drunk to themselves online because they just have like a flag and whatever up there, or some of my friends have fake accounts that are just like hammer and sickles and are just saying horribly mean things. And then I meet, I know them in person. I'm like, well, what are you accomplishing by this?
Yeah.
And they're just doing it for kicks and giggles. But I know some family members that used to only have one gun and now they got 20. And their reasoning is because of very, very progressive people on the internet. So This is Tripp's unsolicited theory. And you can use the code Frodo Foster
for Theology Beer Camp. That's a nice
for $50 off at Theology Beer Camp. And you said underscore is your middle name.
Yeah.
You know what Frodo's name Gandalf gave him when he leaves the Shire is?
Oh, well, something Underhill probably, right?
Yeah. Yeah. So you were just like half a middle name
So close.
Yeah. If it was,
just think. That would be amazing.
Frodo Underhill.
Underscore Underhill. Yeah.
That would probably get $100 off.
I know. Well, maybe I can start a new podcast and change the name to that, which I might have to after this conversation because it's clearly going nowhere. So this is Tripp Fuller.
I would talk about whatever you want.
I know. No, this is Tripp Fuller, everyone. It's really good to have Tripp on the show. Tripp is an author, writer, thinker, podcaster. If you don't know who he is, you're probably not on the internet. Definitely you're not podcasting, theology podcasting. And
they're only friends with suspicious Facebook accounts I've blocked. That's the other option.
That is true. That is the other option. I was going to say, I suspect very few people have done more in the modern age to advance process-influenced open and relational thinking than my friend Tripp. So thank you for that and appreciate it. I've got a couple of your books on my Kindle account right now. I listen to Homebrewed Theology. I'm doing Theology Beer Camp, even though, as you know, I know nothing about alcohol. And some people would say I know nothing about theology, but I disagree with
But
them.
at OrcCon, you were good at staying up late while we smoked cigars and talking and telling
I was
stories.
I was there,
know.
bro. Yeah.
I know. And you participated without being fully spirit-filled.
No, I tried a beer or two. I just don't know what I don't even know what I like. So it's just, it's a joke.
As long as you don't tell everyone your favorite, you're like, I love craft beer, like Blue Moon. That's when you got to worry. When someone
Don't say that?
Don't say that. No.
Okay. All right. How about Angry Orchard? Can I say that?
That's not even a beer. Just don't call it a beer. Say you're like, look, I'm more of a cider guy.
Yeah.
And then when that's the only option, you're like, I prefer English ciders on cask, but
Oh, wow.
I can handle this.
Okay.
These American ones have too much residual sugar. That's the other line. You're like, the English ones are more keto friendly.
I'd be writing this down, but as you probably know, like the podcasts, they all do AI generated text now. So I can go back and copy and paste what you just said, and I'll log it in. I'll have that for future reference. I will be cooler. That's good to know, man. All right. First question. Al Whitehead is to theology what fill in the blank who is to the NBA?
Ooh. Does it need to be recent?
Nope.
Okay. Shaquille O'Neal.
Oh.
All right. Now here's the reason.
Did not see that.
Okay, Shaquille O'Neal did a number of things. One, he's a philosopher. He's the big Aristotle, right?
That's right.
And Alfred North Whitehead is he's like all philosophy's footnotes to Plato. And then what was he doing? He's changes the game dramatically. Whitehead was sitting there right at the new discoveries in kind of the new science, early 20th century. We get general relativity. These kinds of things are blowing up, right? Getting that quantum junk up in this piece. And he's like, look at our philosophy. When we talk about the world, we're talking about a world that still acts as if Newton's account is the most accurate account scientifically. So that means we got to have a whole reorganization of the game. We have to rework the structure. We have this new emergence of science that's like a game changer. And that's like his origin. So Shaq shows up and the NBA has all these rules they've been working with on how to run defense and offense. And then the big Aristotle shows up and he's like, well, what happens if I just happen to be the tallest, strongest, quickest athlete to ever bring their junk to the world? Like right here, I'm going to dominate the paint. I'm faster than you, taller than you, stronger than you. And it gets uncomfortable. There's game changing going on, right? And here's what the NBA had to do with Aristotle, with the big Aristotle, with Shaq. They had to change all the rules.
That's right.
They had to change all the rules. They were like, you know what we don't like? This peak human dominating everyone. And so we've decided, we're going to have to change defensive rules. We're going to have to pretend that only 5% of the fouls that happen to this man get called. And we're because he's just going to keep pulling down championships, just like he pulls down rims. He's going to go Shazam on that. And Shaq isn't even just limited to one field, like Alfred North Whitehead. Starts out mathematician. Oh, no. He's like, but I'm also going to write a metaphysics. Oh, I'm also going to talk about theology and philosophy and stuff. I'm also going to engage interpretations of recent British poetry. Like he's got it coming out. Shaq is also a poet. You've heard him rock the mic before. I mean, he's also a great frontman for all sorts of different things. Now he's doing commentary and stuff. But what happens I think in theology and philosophy in the 20th century is there's this giant question of what do you do with all the new science? Some find ways of updating the inherited ones because they really need to keep it in bounds. And so you get variations of Thomist retrievals, Platonist retrievals, means of like slightly modifying a system to include the new data and include the new discoveries, but it doesn't challenge your kind of foundational assumptions. And those kind of responses, I think, are like, no, this is what the NBA is supposed to be like. Why is this guy dominating everything? So you had all these switches. You see it the way Whitehead gets picked up in theology. Like a lot of people pick up the religion science dialogue, and like, oh, well, he had to, someone who stopped believing in God, Whitehead, for problem of evil issues. Then the science shows up, and then he starts thinking it through, and he basically rebuilds the concept of God. You can see it early on in Science in the Modern World, into Religion in the Making. At first, he's looking at what now might be called like fine tuning and such, and going, so how do we get plausibility structures in each event? How do we explain that all the possibilities for any event are actually honed toward greater possibility, complexity, and depth of relations? You know, there's one thing to give a micro teleology of a moment to an actual entity in the way they relate to their world, but that doesn't even explain the way an ecosystem relates, and unless entities aren't connected just by their materiality, but I don't know, prehension. And then possibilities were not just related by what's inherited from the past and the limits before them, but it's connected to something more eternal, like the forms, right? So you look in Science in the Modern World, and Whitehead eventually is like, well, the sustaining and creating ground that orients moments to moments towards generative habits and patterns of becoming. Generally, we call that God. And over time, he develops more about the concept of God by the time you get to something like Process and Reality, a few books later, when he's given the Giffords, where he's like, not just is this word God the call to the future, and the future towards generative possibilities, adventure, zest, and such. It also, you should not have a metaphysical exception for God. So God also receives the world just like the world receives the lure or call of God. And you get the physical and mental nature of the world, the physical and mental nature of God. That's where the consequent nature of God emerges in his thought, where you get these beautiful passages that a lot of Christian theologians love, like, well, we used to argue about God being with a capital B, the moral authority or judge, these kinds of things. But there's another vision, a Galilean vision, hint, hint, Jesus, it doesn't, it's a little bit oblivious to morals. It nestles on the tender things. It's patient and loving and brings about a generosity of creativity through the struggle and pain of existence. Oh, hell yeah. Give me that junk. And there he goes, why were we missing this? Why are all these Western traditions that have always been kind of bringing in the wisdom of Hellenistic philosophy and the legacy of the Jewish people, why have they been missing this? Maybe the emperor's been editing their theological handbooks, right? And so for a lot of us that find open and relational theology, it's because we are like the NBA, trying to change all the rules around because we'd hate an uncontrolling, completely loving God who's vulnerable to existence to dominate the theological landscape. We'd hate for God to actually look, act, and have a character more loving than Jesus, be who God really is. So we just got to change the rules because we don't want the big Aristotle or the process party to dominate the league, because the league works when you don't have something that's more compelling and beautiful and animating than all the other options. There you go. There's my Alfred North Whitehead and Shaq comparison.
I like it.
It was a long, rambly answer. And
well, that's the kind that we expect from you. And I didn't see Shaq coming, but you're absolutely right. Change the rules of the game. So that totally makes sense. I was thinking you might go, because first of all, because I know you're a Lakers fan, but with the logo, Jerry West, like,
I thought about it.
The logo, Al White, that could be good too. But there's any number of people.
See, but I feel like one of the things of the logo, Jerry West, recently passed, rest in peace, right. Is it took a long time for him to ever get a championship. You know how many times he lost the Celtics?
Right.
I can't be like naming Whitehead as someone that lost in the finals to the Celtics multiple times. Right. Also, he's a logo. And now most people don't even know who the logo is, probably until recently with the news stuff. And so Jerry West is a legendary basketball player, but I think he would be like kind of Heraclitus style, right? Like one of the pre-Socratics that thought becoming was more primary, and it's always hung around because it's on the ball, it's on the thing that's moving in the game. Can't step in the same river twice, right, and all that kind of stuff. But it doesn't, you don't get the breakthrough till you get the big Aristotle, the Shag Daddy, and
big cactus,
and that makes John Cobb.
My favorite.
John Cobb. Would be Kobe Bryant.
I like it. Well, that's the kind that we expect from you. And I didn't see Shaq coming, but you're absolutely right. Change the rules of the game. So that totally makes sense. I was thinking you might go, because first of all, because I know you're a Lakers fan, but with the logo, Jerry West, like, I could see that. Well, let me,
Because there's only one basketball player and one theologian that about 30 minutes after 2 drinks of me thinking about, I start crying. I rewatch Kobe games when I'm sick and stuff, just like I go pick up my favorite passages from John Cobb, and I go, oh, I'm just already anticipating what's going to be there.
Did you ever get to see him play live?
I was in LA. Yeah, when I first moved to LA, it was a glorious experience. Though I think he only had like 28 points that game, but it was masterful. Now I also was in LA, and where they have the Lakers station, and I have until we moved, the volume of Laker games I had recorded on my DVR is significant. Now you can find them online, but when I was doing my PhD and trying to write and stuff at night and was trying to zone out, I would just leave Kobe games on, like watching him cook up Jalen Rose for 81 points. Yeah, it's great.
That was nuts. So
his last game,
unbelievable.
It was one of the greatest experiences. Every time I watch it, it's just
transcendent, not imminent at all, just complete transcendence. I got to watch them live a couple of times, and one in particular I'll never forget was a playoff game against the Suns. We lived in Phoenix, and unfortunately we were Phoenix fans, but we were on like the 4th or 5th row because I had a buddy who gave us some tickets, and Shaq and Kobe. And I'll never forget, and I'm sure every guy who's ever shot a hoop in his life has done the same thing. When you go to a game, you can't help, or baseball or football, whatever it is, you can't help but think, try to think what would it be like to be on the floor. And it was unbelievable to see how big and good and fast Kobe just seemed. Unbelievable. It was kind of like, speaking of theology, honestly, I've never thought about this before, but it was like the first time I read some, Whitehead, or maybe first time I read Catherine Keller, like trying to keep up with that. And, it was impossible at the time, and it still is impossible, but at least now I have a little bit better understanding of what might be going on. But
yeah. And what's funny though is, even playing this game, it transfers appreciation of theology into aesthetics, right? So like you're thinking about what's compelling about a particular player or a team and an era and how they play. And that's how I appreciate the Warriors. Obviously I don't pull for the Warriors, but like watching the Warriors at peak Warrior mode play is just so beautiful.
Right.
I wish it was in purple and gold. You know what I mean?
Right.
And there are like Elizabeth Johnson, She Who Is, early Catholic feminist theologian, take seriously the Thomist vision of the Trinity and the Catholic kind of the way the feminist criticisms get brought in and metabolized by a confessional Catholic theology. And her book, She Who Is, The Doctrine of the Trinity, you wouldn't find anything in it that like Thomas would have to like scratch out aggressively or anything. But it's like a evolution of kind of the Thomist tradition to take seriously that you would never apply accidental language in ultimate ways like masculine to the divine, and receives the tradition in this beautiful egalitarian way. And She Who Is, it's beautiful, like one of the most beautiful books. I'm not Catholic. I don't have the same a priori commitments, and yet I watch it and go, oh, that's like watching Steph Curry. We're like, what in the world? How is this? How is he still walking at the end of a game? What's his step count? And it's beautiful the whole time. And within a split second, the ball has touched his hands and is in the net, and the defender looks humiliated. And she starts it out right at the beginning of She Who Is, and she makes an observation about the language of God functions, right? To inscribe orientations and habits in reality, and then goes, well, but we don't think God literally has a penis or is an actual dude, but we have preserved the Trinitarian language because that's the actual relations that we see in Jesus to the one he calls Abba, and engaging the life of the Spirit that's normative. And if we get rid of all that language, we get rid of what binds the relational love of God together. But it's not like we think God has a piece. So then what happens when we look at the consequences of language, where it's a form of misplaced concreteness, right, in the life of the church? And she's like, just watch how the ball moves. If you aren't having to run it through the phallus the whole time. And it's more compelling as an argument for like the beauty of the Trinity and why the church should utilize it and seize it than if you're hearing someone just defend it in a kind of more ancient way, even though content-wise, they're both talking about the Trinity, right? They're both playing basketball. Mm-hmm. But aesthetically, I'm just like, oh, look at that. Look at that.
That's beautiful. That's beautiful. I like that. Hey, recently I had your friend and mine on, Andrew Davis, and we talked about, you made me think of this when you mentioned beauty. We talked about, he calls them 10 Whiteheadian transitions. And I just tend to just say, generally transitions that our culture has gone through or is going through that make it a good time to think open and relational theology. So how about I read a couple, three of them to you and see which ones you think are super cool. Well, they're all super cool. Which ones you want to make a comment on? So he talks about things like the move from exception to exemplification, the movement from force to persuasion, the movement from decadence to adventure. Any of those three you want to comment on? Any of those that jump out?
I like all of them.
I know, they're all good.
Okay, but the exception to exemplification one?
Yeah.
And I'll give a philosophy example and a theological one, the kind of maybe spell these out. So a philosophical one, this is something, the 3 years I was at the University of Edinburgh, I was working on a project around philosophy of mind and how a lot of the new science around consciousness is problematizing the kind of inherited ideas. A lot of more scientifically minded philosophies of consciousness will make a rather reductive statement that consciousness is an epiphenomena, something that comes out of all of our brain states and such. And there's nothing extra to explain with consciousness. We're just going to get rid of it. And then others are like, no. They're good dualists. That you're missing something if you think that a human and our experience, our first person experience of being ourselves, isn't real. And the dualist option has been that there's some spirit there, right? Not just matter, there's spirit. Most of the time in modernity, like because of Descartes and company, you give spirit to humans or whoever has a soul or this kind of thing. And maybe you extend it a little bit more to angels one direction, or maybe close other species in another. But then we start doing a lot of different research that problematizes these. One example, Jonathan Delafield Butts and someone I got to work with a little bit is doing studies on twins in utero, right? So if part of how you explain a reductive materialist account of mind is to go, well, the brain develops and then you do these things that behaviors that equal mind, like agental action and interpretation of the world. Well, what happens when there are twins in utero and there's no brainstem and they're playing? They're doing actions that if we aren't allowed to, include our consciousness as something real, right? Then what is it that's generating the action that you then, when we talk to an adult, explain away with our brainstem, our developed cognition? So there's that. Sitting there. So that's one exemption. So then you go, well, what if it isn't an exception, but it's exemplifying? What if our first person consciousness is exemplifying reality? Well, in that case, mind isn't something you have to insert at some point if you're a dualist, or something you repress, deny, reject. Our first person experience is genuine empirical evidence of sorts, not empirical it'd be radical empiricism, but it would be evidence that we've all firsthand experience of what it's like to be a thing or to be an event. And so then you would be something like a pan-experientialist, a pan-psychist of sorts, where there is one monism in the world. It's just it has both sides of it, a mental and a physical pole. And the mental and physical poles grow in complexity through the evolutionary story. We're an exemplification of it, a complex exemplification of it, but we're not an exception. And that would mean you're seeing when you look at nature, right? We're giving back to the rest of the world the things we cut out of it. The inside story of the world, we cut out of it because of modern materialist science. And does that make sense? How something like that?
Well, we cut the science out, but we also, chopped up the divine in the middle of all that too.
Yeah, Whitehead calls it the bifurcation of nature. That, and he has this passage where he kind of jokingly says to people that enjoy a poem and going to science, he's like, why are, just like a poem, you only experience, you're providing all the experience. Why do you have a poem about a red rose when you're the one that gives all the redness to the rose? Why do you say, oh, this smells so sweet? You're the one providing that. These are all things your consciousness projects onto it. It's not in the other thing. You see, he's playing and going, you're missing the point. When we bifurcate nature and the only things we're allowed to call a part of nature are the parts you can put under a microscope or engage empirically, then the problem is how you framed the scientific endeavor. That was Whitehead's kind of point. And then out of him, you have various forms of panpsychism, pan-protopsychism, pan-experientialism, and such. Another example of that same kind of move is in Christology. Is Jesus an exception or exemplar? For some, the incarnation is divine invasion, right? The world is inherently problematic apart from God, and you need a divine invasion in order to redeem it, maybe occasional invasions for parting of seas and such. Or Jesus is an exemplification. So for process relational framework, God is where we live, move, and have our being. God meets every entity where it's at and invites it to participate through the lure of God in the greatest beauty, truth, and goodness that's available. So then what happens when God doesn't need to intervene in order to show up? How would you even talk about Jesus? What are you saying? He's just fully human? Well, fully human in a particular way. What if he is the exemplar in the sense that he's fully faithful to the call, the one he knows as Abba, moment to moment? You could say that through his fidelity, he is the image of the invisible God. And so he's an exemplification because of his faithfulness, but he's not an exception. And in fact, the early church thought very much similar things, right? You're baptized into Christ. Let the same mind be in y'all that was in Christ. These kinds of images are there. And so when you take a position like this, then all of a sudden there's the language of doxology in the early church. The Eucharist imagery we get, the earliest hymn we get in Psalm 2 or Philippians 2, these kind of images are no longer just like metaphors. They're literal in the sense that Paul is describing that what was exemplified in Christ is something we come to participate in, and you get to respond to it every moment to moment. You're called to respond to the love of God in Christ Jesus. And look, you aren't the exemplar, okay? You may say no and reject the call, will, lure of God all the way to Sheol. And guess what else is in Sheol? The love of God in Christ Jesus. Why? Because you can't escape it. You see, so like when you make that shift, it helps us think about certain philosophical problems like consciousness, how we've made nature mute to then manage, control, and such. And it helps us see that Jesus is both the exemplar of what it means to be fully human, the image of the invisible God, and his life then becomes something we're called to participate in, emulate, and that he's an exemplar, but he's simultaneously, the Christological phrase would be the means, right? So we participate in the Spirit of Christ as the church and the model, and it's not like there was something in his humanity that was cut out to make space for the divine. It's his receptivity and fidelity to the divine that occasions, right, him being the exemplar or the model and the means.
It's so good. There's 100 different things that helped me, moving into open relational thinking. But one of them you're touching on, well, it has to do with this whole exemplification thing. But just to back up a bit, like the nature piece, like the only thing that's nature is what we can put under the microscope. Yes, to reiterate what you're saying is that's absurd because we are nature, putting nature under a microscope. Yeah. And so we don't see ourselves in it. Similarly, with respect to Jesus, something about superimposing that idea over that helps me with him. It's not that he's this objective, separate thing, but that we can find ourselves in him and he in us. And what I thought of recently, I'd never really thought about. I was speaking actually at Mark Feldmeyer's church.
Mm-hmm.
And afterwards I was chatting with someone because I did a thing on grief. And so there was a lot of conversation, and this elderly lady came up to me, and it was striking how, of all the people I talked to that day, like she's one of the ones I remember the most. Her pain was as intense as any. But what she said was a little peculiar. She was older. She said, I don't have any children. I don't have any grandchildren. And she said, I grieve not having grandchildren, and I interact with people all of the time. And so when I wrote something in the book, I wrote something I never wrote before, which was something to the effect of, by the way, I hate writing in books because I put so much pressure on myself to say something cool and to sign my name right, and I always screw up. It's like time zones. I always screw it up. Anyhow, I said something to the effect of thinking about Jesus, who was single, turns out has the biggest family on the planet Earth, billions of people in his family, but it was single. And somehow I was going to make the connection to what you were saying earlier about, I guess, just the entanglement of the divine with all of us, and not being this completely separate thing. It's just been so helpful for me to move in that kind of health.
Mm-hmm. No, I like that. The other place in Jesus where I think of having lots of kids is that when Jesus isn't an exception, then what Jesus said, did, and endured becomes like the site of revelation. It's the site of revelation isn't just what we say about Jesus and confess, like he is risen. It's he is risen because that matters, because of what he said, did, and endured. And Jesus wasn't the Christ alone. He did it in community. It's not, we would not interpret him correctly if the actual gospel narratives were just page fluff to get around to a statement. And he did it in community. He called people, he empowered them, he sent them, he trusts them. In the Gospel of John, he says, I'm going to send the Paraclete, you'll do greater things than me. And Luke Acts sends out the 12, then the 70, and then Pentecost. These kinds, the narratives contain a community, a Christological community, I think is helpful for me. And it's also like one of the reasons I try not to get jaded, cynical, and ultimately dismissive of the church, given in historical moments, being embarrassed by it, right. Because I feel like there's a temptation that when harmed or embarrassed or like morally disgusted in these kinds of things from an encounter with the church in a particular place, that we leave it behind and imagine that we're able to do our faith solo, even though Jesus couldn't. Mm-hmm. And I'm not confident in my ability to do that. And I don't think a sweet deconstruction Instagram would make me confident about it either.
Well, yeah, I totally agree. My only pushback would be, how do you define church? Because we obviously got to continue to reapproach and rethink what that means. Because far too many people might hear you say that and go like, oh, well, yeah, then I got to continue to go back to the same building that's perpetuated these same, myths and ideas that have not been healthy. So. Mm-hmm.
Well, yeah, I mean, I think part of it is certain parts of the church like to imagine that they are the totality of the church itself. Oddly enough, it tends to be ones that didn't even exist for the first 3/4 of church history. So there's just like one of those moments, right? I don't know if I should say their name. Okay, but a famous Catholic theologian, also up in the aristocracy, was like, I had made this point. We were at a conference, and he said, yeah, but that's also true for the Catholic Church, because we like to imagine that the institution we're in was set up rather early on, even though we all know it's not true.
Right.
And that the church has always been more diverse than any authority or community could speak for. And so I think that And I would say, like, institutionally bounding the spiritual body of Christ is heretical from day one, right? So think of like Augustine and City of God. Like, even someone you would think is like the peak Western Christianity, he's making that distinction. And Jesus didn't say, like, I'll be under a steeple or something like that. Where will Jesus promise to be when two or three are gathered in my name, right? Like, when you're going to be Christ one to another, and your commitment is to the people across the table. And sometimes that means calling each other out. Sometimes that means proclaiming your belovedness when the other one doesn't believe it. It means all those things. Then he said, I'll be when you retell my story in the breaking of bread and the sharing of the table. When you're doing something very physical that's required, I show up there. And then when you meet the least of these, right? So if you wanted to know where Christ was, or the body of Christ was, you could tend to the other. You could tend in deep friendship and vulnerability in a spirit of grace, and you can do it by retelling a story where betrayers, deniers, are offered the life of God. So, you know what I mean? Like, so I think there's lots of ways, and oftentimes, especially in places of privilege, we like to abstract the spiritual life of the body of Christ and insert it in institutions that we can manage, defend, and control. And so there are lots of ways the church exists without institutional baggage and all that kind of stuff. And throughout church history, you get waves of people leaving it and trying to find like a way to rebuild it. The move to the desert in the early church, the monastery system, the Protestant reformers early on, the radical reformers more insistently. Like, you get these kind of moves to the margin to re-engage Christ where Christ promised to be, in relationships, at the table, in service and care of the other. And the other thing I think that's helpful is, and this is something Whitehead makes a big deal of in looking at the problems of Western Christianity, is he goes, look, Christianity's genius is it tells a story about a prophet who's executed on a cross and doesn't tell them what they have to think philosophically. They have to rebuild their system in every generation to make sense of this, right? And you can think of Paul, right? Like the weakness of God, the folly of God, these kinds of things in the cross. And so when I think of people who leave the church and are hurt and harmed and burdened, and like, I'm not showing back up to that, Tripp, what is this BS? I think, well, it's usually because we see people being put on crosses by this institution and go, I can't do this. But in that situation, I think you go to the people that are bearing the crosses in the present, and that's the site of revelation. That's where you see the dynamics of the Spirit of God at work, and you come out of there, right? So
you go interact with those people, and you start a new church.
Yeah, and in fact. And it may not even be that new if you're a person of privilege. We like to think that we are the arrival of God.
Good point.
If you're an open relational theologian, there's actually been no instance of all human history, and for billions of years before he showed up, where all that came before it wasn't received into the divine life, and all that's possible before it isn't something God's so invested in, God is calling. And so the moment you take an open relational framework, and I think for Christians, the valuation of the world that was revealed in the Christ, then when it's the new, we might have a new form of community or something like that, but we need to get the new out of the hands of an institution, because modern Christianity has tended to think that the church was how God managed to show up when we went to new places, and sometimes we did a better job of introducing them to an extractive economic system than we did to our gospel or orientation. It's not going to be a new, like, you're the one that brings God to arrive somewhere.
Right.
You're only getting there because you said yes to the call of God. So listen before you decide what it is, what the agenda is.
Yeah, no, thanks for making that distinction. That's an important distinction for two Caucasian, American heterosexual, people who have had the opportunity to sit and read and think through these things. That's an important distinction to make. So yeah, I think I'm thinking of those individuals like you have in your life too, who I'm constantly in conversation with, who are trying to figure out what they do next, because they have no desire to go back into any kind of institutionalized power thing. And frankly, I don't either, and I can't blame them for what they've been through. So the new thing that's happening in their lives that might help them get caught up in the ancient thing, we like to call love. And speaking of love, here's a good question for you. Well, I don't know if it's a good question, but
can I ask you a follow-up real quick?
Yeah.
And you really answer. Don't do the like podcast host deflect thing. So and you know, my wife and I are both ordained. So until recently, one of us has always been working at a church. So it's not like I'm currently experiencing how depressing church shopping can be, and like trying to find one where you value. And also,
Yeah.
I think of a new understand. Also, the church we're managed to get involved with, we're really faithful on Wednesday nights where there's food and interactive arts and all that kind of stuff, and then sporadic in other ways. Though as someone who ends up preaching half the time at other churches, I imagine I'm a very church person. But one of the things I think that gets dismissed too quickly when we are at a distance from the power of the liturgy is the habit forming hermeneutics that it gives you, right? So worship, you begin by proclaiming with gratitude the goodness of life and the gift of life and the gift of people around you. And you're like, in worship, we are going to tend to a God who loved us before we could speak. And then the next thing you do is you do something that Americans hardly ever do. You confess that you're screwed up out loud with a whole bunch of people, next to people who you probably should have already apologized to and are too prideful to tell your partner or your kids you're sorry. And then you do it because you're in a context of grace where you know what happens next is that someone voices on behalf of God that the most true thing about you is you're God's beloved and all these kinds of things. And then you listen to the wisdom of ancient people, the early church and the Hebrew people read and proclaimed, and you sing in unison, which does all sorts of things for you. Like there's this whole movement that moves through worship that if you are an open relational thinker is practice for the interpretation of every moment. In every moment of life, there's an orientation of gratitude. In every moment you've just completed, there is a judgment within the life of God of the ways in which beauty, truth, goodness, love, adventure, zest were not actualized in your living, and a proclamation that grace has sustained you and grace gives you an opportunity for deeper participation in the next. And then it's one that goes like where you're existing in the world is woven in a story of these two peoples who are full of their brokenness and failures and breakthroughs of newness and transformation. And then you're being sent out into the world at the end of it with this gratitude, the confidence of grace and the call of one who loves you to internalize that rhythm in your living. And in a time where even our public discourse is less, it specializes in the judgment, but not in the grace. I think we miss something when we haven't found a community to do that orientation, which is unrelated to whether I think there needs to be an institution proper for everyone or whatnot. But I think there's something in that rhythm of doing it in a community where that kind of grace-filled opening possibilities, when we miss it, we miss it. And I didn't notice it till, I wasn't in charge of them all the time. And in talking to lots of people through like the homebrewed classes and when Tom and I were doing all that stuff for the God After Deconstruction project and things, that's something some people name they miss, and others observe the habits of their heart when that rhythm's not there. Even if they had learned to translate stupid theology on verse 3 of a song or expand the horizon of the sin being confessed to the institutional and social. But I wonder, like, how do you think about that? Because to me, that that is the thing I worry most about as a parent is like, I know, I mean, I'm a bad job, but I keep hours, I have a spiritual rhythm and things that were inherited and formed in me and things. But there's one thing to teach it as personal piety, and there's other to be in a community that says we orient ourselves this way. And knowing the social psych, the orientation in a community has more power than just the familial, just what happens in a home. Though combined, they're the best. But you know what I mean? Does that make sense? That's what I worry about.
Yeah. So the question is, how do we approach? How do you think about this, the rhythm of what you're doing? How do you incorporate that in and see all the really important things that you just mentioned, and hold it loosely with all the dysfunctional garbage that has gone on? Yeah, my partner and I, we talk about it all the time. Similar to you, yeah, she and I have been. I mean, I've been a pastor off pretty much my whole life, and now the last couple of years have not been. And of course, that story in and of itself, like a lot of people, is a whole story. I mean, to be jettisoned out officially of a denomination over essentially, imperialistic matters, even though it was about LGBTQ, but it's really about power and all kinds of stuff. That sets you up to be jaded and cynical, and so we struggle with that all the time. And the truth is, I think 99 out of 100 churches, when we're here in Kansas City or when we're in Colorado too, I just frankly, as much as I agree with all that stuff you just said, I'm not sure I'd be able to walk into. But we have found a minority of churches that at least we can kind of work through. And I totally agree. If you can be there and expose yourself, that's the wrong terminology. You don't want to expose yourself at church. If you can be there and be present, and hold loosely to your own thoughts, and you feel like you can be with at least a few people. It doesn't have to be everyone, but at least a few people around you are intellectually honest and humble. It's super important. I find it very interesting when we're in Kansas City. I don't know if you know Tim Suttle. He wrote a book called Shrink, and he's working on a doctorate with Peter Rollins and Todd McGowan and others. That you would find super interesting. I know you're not a huge psychodynamic guy, but I know you know that as well as anyone. But I love Tim's what he's doing, and that their little congregation. You know what my favorite thing to do is when we show up. My favorite part of the service is the prayers of the people, and when they ask us to be quiet, and they're really good about being uncomfortably quiet for about even like 2 minutes. 1 or 2 minutes is a long time when you're with 200 other people. Every week, I find that to be my favorite time. And that is odd to me. It's like there's noise around me. There's kids around. I feel like maybe it's a collective consciousness thing I'm entering into with other people. It's not just being quiet by yourself. It's being quiet with other people. And then they go into prayers, and some of the prayers, just by virtue of the person standing up front or what they're reading, are different language than I would use. And it kind of forces, maybe neurologically, spiritually, my brain, heart to go in a way that I might not have said them in those ways. So I totally agree. All of that stuff is really important in forming. And at the same time, so many people have been through so many bad things. And I'm not still comparing myself to others who've maybe been abused, but I am one of those people. Yeah, just to hold that all loosely is really challenging, but I think really, really important.
And I think that that makes me think when you mentioned like the new thing, right? Like doing something new. A lot of times people think when you do something new, you're getting the list that a church planter gets, right? Yeah. Like where there's this whole project. My family were church planters. I know you know this experience. But I wonder if there's, if you just lower the job description of what an institution's supposed to be doing, like there is a certain power of sharing a communal rhythm. And I don't think it has to be in the same way we've done it in the past. Yeah. Something I've been thinking about, if I managed to organize things where I had more margin is trying something digitally where what if there's a podcast type feed, but where only the days on, right? So it's a daily rhythm podcast where it's rather short, but it moves through the things. But if you're listening to it, you're listening only with people that one day, because you literally can't listen the next day. There's only one episode ever available. As a way of knowing I'm not alone in this. And you could have ways of people interacting digitally, but just the sense that you're sharing this experience of receptive gratitude, critical reflection before God of love and justice, affirmation of the deep belovedness of you, your neighbor, your enemy, and the call to walk in that love with the Spirit, moment to moment, something like that. So that's what I mean. When you church plant, you think, oh, well, am I going to get a building? How am I going to build a support structure? How am I going to do all these groups? How am I going to do this? There might be ways for people that are in that wilderness space, or an exiled space, or a liminal space, this transition space of spirit, to have community in that rhythm, and know that there are thousands of people that had that little 20-minute thing each day. The other thing that popped in head about that, the shared silence, the best clergy person I ever worked with was a hardcore Jungian. That's what his doctorate was on. Mm-hmm. And when I got to work at that church,
I thought you were going to say Girardian for a second, but that's fine. Jungian's fine too.
when I got to work at the church, when you do whichever, there were three of us preaching that rotated, but whoever, one of you would do the sermon type thing, one of you would do the prayer type thing, right? So two people were always in worship leadership other than lay people. And the structure for the prayer, you do the prayer of confession and things, and then you do the pastoral prayer, and then there's a minute of silence, and then the Lord's Prayer. And I hadn't 60 seconds in a room with hundreds of people is a lot of silence, by the way. You may be comfortable in your office for 20,
right?
But when you're in a worship gathering with 400, it is intense. And so there's a clock up on the wall that no one else can see, so you know how long it's there. And I think you're right, because the language that comes from the Psalms and these kinds of things that go into it, of describing our brokenness before a loving God, and things, and then the affirmation of your identity as love. Then it goes in the silence, and in that silence, it's all the kind of mythopoetic structure and wisdom of Israel is humming, and the love of God revealed in Christ is sitting there. But then how it bubbles up in each of us is different, but it is a shared experience. And then first word out of it, our Father, and in unison. And I was like, what's up with this order? And which was set up for about an hour-long Jung monologue that we argued about for a year or two, till just the impact of it made it compelling. And so when you said that, that's what I thought. But that element is, how do you simulate being in a room who think that no one has something positive to contribute externally, or vocalizing something right now? We've named our love, we've named our frailty, and then we're sharing silence. And then out of it, you're only saying, when Jesus said, how do we pray? Pray this way. And it begins. It was one of these things where I was like, I'm not even sure about Jung, but I'm sure this is good. And those spaces of silence, I imagine we could come up with ways of hosting essentially communal encounters with the mind of Christ, that don't involve a lot of the criticisms, eye-rolling meetings, and things about it. But we're also at a transition point, I think, in American Christianity, where the institutions, denominations, all these kinds of structures that flourished in the past don't meet the moment. So creativity, exploration of what it looks like, all that kind of stuff's true. And I think you named something I hadn't thought of just that is a power that exists when image bearers tend to silence together. before a loving God that it's hard to do right on Zoom in the same way. Or
you're right. No, totally. I'm in these same conversations, like, trying to potentially create digital spaces, but then how to replicate that. And then, of course, you think, well, we could still get people together in smaller groups and try to do some of that. So what this day and age calls for is us, some research and development and some creativity and experimentation, just not returning back to the old powerful institutionalized structures.
yes.
Speaking of all that, how about this kind of question thought? I know in my journey, a lot of this deconstruction, reconstruction stuff. Oh, side note, that's another one of your books I have handy. I think I've got the physical book laying right here, God After Deconstruction, you and Tom. And thank you. When you guys have been talking about that, that you're making the distinction, by the way, between the cultural moment of deconstruction that we're in and the philosophical idea, because that's highly frustrating when a word gets co-opted like that and used, and we forget about, or most people don't even realize the depth of what deconstruction is.
It's also true about the first word in the book title.
God.
It gets co-opted.
Very true. Yeah, very true. Anyhow, there's the whole rabbit trail we go there. That would be good too. But I was going to ask you, so in my journey, I realized I'm either creating new language, new theological language, or I'm rehabilitating old language. Either way, it's super hard. To create new language, I got to make up new words. Then I got to explain to people what these words mean. And I have to train my neurons to fire a particular way when I say that word. However, it's the same thing if I'm rehabilitating old words. I've got to, every time I say a word, think about what I want it to mean and the health in that. And so, for example, I'll give you a couple words and then I'll invite you to maybe share something similar if you relate. But like, for example, a word I clearly was not wanting to get rid of and I had to rehabilitate was the word love, which is just overused and, Americanized Christianity anyhow. And so now when I say love, my brain goes somewhere in a split second to this. It's an uncontrolling, non-binary, non-violent, non-scapegoating energy in relationship with God and others meant for flourishing. Now, I don't know what I thought. What's that?
I said I'd retweet that.
Yeah, exactly. It should be. I don't know what I thought 10 years ago, but it didn't contain all those words. But now in a split second, so it's rehabilitating. But it's funny because I use that language, and when I'm talking to someone else using love, they're not using that. So we have that whole thing. But then there's also other words that I frankly just can't use at all. And a great example of that is like the word sovereign. It's just not in my lexicon. Now, being Wesleyan Arminian, it wasn't, to be fair, as much maybe as some other Americanized Christians. But still, it's just, I'm not even interested in it being around, so I don't even use it. So all that to say, long setup question, what are some words that you've rehabilitated? What are some words that you don't use? And or is that just a unhealthy way to approach it?
Okay, so here's the kind of, my initial response is the words that are hardest to use that we think rehabilitate or cut out are ones where the experience of them is negative. And so, or how the word gets used, how it gets leveraged, is something that clearly didn't lead to flourishing. And so that need is something that's important. So the part of it is is that even accurate? Right? You might ask that question. Or what are the different options in the tradition for thinking with this concept or vision? Why did it emerge? And is there something to learn there? And so I feel like there's a kind of a discernment moment, because sometimes, I was in conversation the other day with a minister who's Southern Baptist and recently got kicked out because their church has a female clergy, and watch out. And when we were talking, like what was contained in the word sin for him was something where he's like, I don't even want to use that word anymore, right? But what was contained in it was hardly even Augustine's understanding of sin, which is more compelling than most progressives know, because I don't think they've read him, or they've read the 5 quotes that people complain about him use, and so like part of it, I think there's a discernment point of what's being released from the theological imagination of the church if you get rid of it. And then some people, especially those of us that are much more nerdy, like to think, well, let's fix the idea first. And obviously it's in a theology podcast or when you're writing a book or whatever, you kind of tend there. But as clergy and as a parent and things, I think a part of the reason we have bad ideas is because our actual experience in the church, this word was connected to these encounters or this framing. Sure. Yeah. And so as church leaders or faith leaders or as parents trying to hand our tradition on in a beautiful way, that's the part, the language or stories or ideas are there. How do we hand them on without that kind of baggage? If in our process of discernment, there's something worth for us, right, retrieving or reconstructing, but we don't need to jettison it to only have the crappy version be the encounter of those we're leading in some way. And so when I worked with students, I kind of worked backwards from experiences. So we would do things I would call experiments in truth, via Gandhi and such, where they're experiments in doing the teachings of Jesus, so that the theological language exists in the tradition, gets interpreted through a community at doing experiments in the practices or teachings. Yeah. And then they change. One example of that is the first time I did this, I was with a group of 16 to 18-year-olds for confirmation. And I'm like, we're going to invent experiments. And you just have to pick any teaching of Jesus. We're following through the church calendar and doing lectio on the gospel of that year, which was Matthew. And Jesus has that line, do not judge, right? And so they picked that, and we're going to do an experiment. And so what we agreed to do was everyone in confirmation's on a text chain. So when you text a name or initials or a fake name, if everyone else in the group knows the person, when you get it, we've all agreed that when we have our phone and see it, you have to do it immediately, but you'll do a short prayer for that name. So like, God, you made, like if I texted Jonathan, then everyone that sees it would say, God, you made and know and love Jonathan completely. Give Tripp the eyes to see Jonathan as you see him, and the courage to love him as you will him be loved. And so we're going to do this for a month, and each week we would kind of talk about it. By the time you get to week 3, someone eventually texts themselves. So now I text Tripp, and then you're like, God, you made and know and love Tripp completely. Give him the eyes to see Tripp as you see him, and the courage to love him as you will him be loved. Well, then when you start to unpack that, it's like everyone's like, well, that was weird. And then it kind of opens up. The next week, almost everyone, when they text, are going to text themselves as much as they text anyone else. Mm. And so if you think of why they picked it, they're thinking of religious authorities, parents, everyone above them, judging them for what they've done wrong, where they're inadequate. They're thinking of their peers. You're not good enough, pretty enough, what, insert all the ways we judge. And then through that process, you discover that the greatest judgment most of us carry is for ourselves, because we don't really believe that, if we're honest, that all of us is genuinely loved before God. There are parts, and those are the parts put on our Facebook profile, or they wouldn't use it, too young. But you know what I mean? There are these parts, but then there are these others. And what happens when you walk out into a world experiencing yourself as even deficient before God? Then you do to others what you do to yourself. Right? It was like you could say, love God and love your neighbor as yourself is like a true statement. Yeah. So like through this process, we have each other praying that you'll actually learn to love fully the person you see in the mirror. And that transforms the way you see other people, because guess what? If those that are in confirmation with you that only got 16 years of baggage to affirm, guess what all of us adults are doing and our grandparents are doing? This is a beautiful secret. So that even that one line opens up to this. Now, in that context, when we eventually get around to talking about God's judgment and things like that, it rings different. You want to know what no one asked? Well, what about Gandhi? Does he go to hell? No one asked that question because it's dumb. It's just a bad question. But if your experience of thinking about God's judgment leads you to see yourself as deficient in everyone else, then you live in fear. If judgment is a context where you're open about the problems of reality before a loving God, and the invitation of God is embracing the fullness of an honest reality, inviting it into potentials that God knows, loves, and calls us to that we've yet to actualize, it's a very different experience. Then you actually learn to see potential in yourself. And as you learn to see it in yourself, you learn to see it in your neighbor. You love to see it in your enemy, people you've never even give the dignity of humanity to. So to me, I think that the act of rehabilitation, that we cut ourselves off from the experience of God because we're worried about how ideas get defined. And I think those definitions can be transformed by actual practicing the way of Jesus together. And theoretically, maybe those individuals, when they hear others, talk about God or judgment or X, Y, and Z, they're like, that's weird. Because they learn the language and stories of the tradition in a different context. One where the invitation not to judge and that command is Jesus standing beside you when you look in the mirror and you're going, I'm not good enough. I failed here. I'm a loser, blah, 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 blah. And Jesus going, that's above your pay grade, son or daughter. But, I'm in the South now. So son is a universal, you universally apply it when you're giving someone a teaching moment. It's like Jesus going, it's above your pay grade. Like the one I called Abba made everything, sustains everything, and made you, knows you completely and loves you completely. God loves the parts of you you don't love. And now if you think you're going to tell the creator of all that you're not lovable, you're wrong. You're just wrong. That's a lie. You believe a lie. You know what lies are good for? Diminishment of life, cutting you off from the flourishing that's possible in relationship with other people that bear image. It's above your pay grade to see yourself as anything less than the beloved of God. In fact, we told you that when we baptized you while you were pooping on the minister's hand. It's always been true. You don't get to shake it. Your enemy can't even shake it. So if you're going to sit here and not judge, then it's above your pay grade to disagree with God. And while you are God's enemy, God chose you. Before the foundations of the earth, see, thinking back how you get to sovereignty, the God whose love refused to be God without us. And not just without some of us, or not without parts of us, all of you. That's how you get to a point where the image of the invisible God is sitting on a cross, looking down at the person that put him there and says, Abba, my God, forgive them, for they don't know what they're doing. We don't know what we're doing. We look at ourselves and can't believe that God's refused to be God without us. And the most true thing about us is that we're God's beloved. And then when we can't trust that word, God's word, the one who made you, about you, then what are you going to do when you look at your neighbor or your enemy or your parent who's critical or your coach is making complaints? You're going to think that those judgments are about your value. They're not invitations to grow or change. You're going to receive everything as a deficit to your being. But guess what? Not only is it above your pay grade to disagree, mommy and daddy don't get, it's above their pay grade. You think they brought themselves into existence? No. God has been in this cosmic epoch luring new complexities of beauty and truth into greater possible responsiveness to him. And you're a part of a species that's more responsible than you could ever imagine. And that God has been very patient, loving, and calling. And you know why? Because you're the very site of God's ongoing work. Now, do you really think, if all this is true, that when we talk about the judgment of God, it is the morality police, elf on a shelf on holy steroids, or is judgment a seeing of reality where all those who are known and loved completely of God, by God, find our own ideas, our own lies to keep ourselves from loving ourselves, from our neighbor, and from our enemy. And then in that space, the judgment of God is one where those who are victims and those who are violators find themselves reconciled in the story of one who didn't do that. Like, so anyway, you see, so and I think I could go ahead and say all these things to a bunch of students and they'll be like, oh, it's another version of poetics about the divine and this one's nicer than the other one. But if you just spend a month where there are a whole bunch of people coming of age with everything that happens in 16 to 18, and they became vulnerable and honest, and they were actually in a room of people that prayed because they confessed that they could not judge themselves. And that group said, yeah, but we're praying that God gives you the eyes to see yourself as God does. Then that experience legitimates a more beautiful theology.
Yeah.
And I think Protestants broadly and American Protestants, for a lot of reasons, think that if we just change people's ideas and fix them, then they'll have a different experience of the divine. And I think the intuitions that come out of a process relational framework is, well, no, let's build community and relations where just to interpret those experiences require a redefinition. And when you hear other people using Christian language where something less compelling and beautiful and inspiring gets used, you go, oh, I don't know exactly why that's bad theology. I just know it is. Mm-hmm. And that to me is, I mean, that's why earlier when I brought up that question of our shared experience of that silence and things like that, that a process relational framework, I think, says what we do in the character of our experience in surrogate has more power to shape us than even if everyone learned how to say primordial nature, consequent nature, prehension, concrescence, superject, and other cool words that we learned. It was very helpful, and it's helped us work this stuff out. But what is it helping us work out? It helps me work out my experience with God in light of 9/11 and seeing Islamophobia and militaristic nationalism emerge and blah, 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 blah. It helps you process the vision of God you had and the encounter of tragedy and loss in your family. And then what do you do with this? And how do you, like, all those ideas help with that. But as stewards of a tradition and such, I feel like, we can help people piece things back together and talk about it. But in the living of the tradition, let's create relationships where we orient the communal energy to encounter the God we've had to wrestle to get there, so that when they hear the language and things, it's been defined by actual encounters with people who've loved and cared for them and such. So that's kind of how I try to do it. And thank you for coming to my sermon.
Exactly. I feel like we should take an offering. That's great. You're totally, I think, healthy and accurate and correct in reframing it as, again, lived experience. It speaks back to this whole conversation we're having about faith, community, and church and why the importance of it. And it's different than a way a lot of American Christianity approaches it. Like you're saying, who want to approach it in a cognitive, like, let's define it in this way, rather than bringing that lived experience in first. And of course, your example lends itself even more to that, because you're getting to interact in that particular situation with young people. And so I think I'm thinking it more of as I, appear at different in theological circles, either online or in person, is speaking to adults who've now carried this baggage, and I don't get the opportunity to live with them, which I'm not saying that's neither right nor wrong. It's just a reality that we're in. Mm-hmm. I'm still not going to use the word sovereign.
Oh, well, I mean, I'm not reformed.
Don't have time. I just don't have time. I just have to.
I'm not reformed enough to worry about it. Here's how I would do it if I had to. I've only had to when speaking at Presbyterian places and they, are pressing it.
Right.
Then I usually say sovereignty is the theological category for a creator God who decided that the creation's cooperation with the divine is the very means by which love comes to be. And so sovereignty is God's fidelity to human life and all of its burdensome complexities. God is sovereign because God holds each creature near and dear, regardless of how it resists the invitation. Sovereignty is a statement that you hear in the people of Israel, God's hesed love, faithful love, tenacious love. Sovereignty is a category that only makes sense when God is love without remainder. And we ruin the category when we decide that the power of God is loving on occasion and and such.
Yeah.
But you know I'm not sure I ever use that word in a context where it has not already been introduced. You know?
Right. Yeah.
And if you do, like, actually, if you're in the Reformed tradition and such, I actually think Karl Barth, how he does it, is about as beautiful as you can manage to get it. So the sovereignty of God is revealed in the Son who goes into the far country, right? So the sovereignty of God isn't about like micromanaging and controlling or determining these things. The sovereignty of God, and he believes in creation out of nothing. So the God who loves in freedom chose to create, to receive the judgment of our failings into the divine life through the Son, and to redeem all creation. And so to create is the choice to get to new creation. And how that story is told is the Son that goes off into the far country, because there is no country that's not part of God's sovereign embrace into the divine life. And there's a number of theological assumptions in it I don't have, but it's like, if that's your tribe, then like the most important, the Reformed theologians of the 20th century describe sovereignty that way. Barth does it that way. Moltmann levels it up in other ways.
Logo, Moltmann.
Yeah, there you go. So, yeah.
That's good, man. Yeah, thank you for saying that. Well, I know we could talk all day, and you got people to interview on Homebrewed Theology, the most freaking listened to theological show in the history of mankind. How many downloads have you had this year?
Fun thing, I only really check stats once a year. I'm not suggesting this is a good idea. I just worry too much. I pay too much attention to what
Me too.
works or doesn't work.
Yep.
And I find the podcast, I mean, it's very old at this point. It's driving. Part of how it's gone this long is because I'm always interested in whatever I'm doing and excited about it. And I read the people's books and talk to them. So
right.
I try not, but last year was like 5.5. So
5.5 million.
Yeah.
I wanted to make sure the listeners knew that. Because if it was me, they'd be like, oh, 5,500. Jonathan's doing well.
Well, in a year, this was a year, not.
I know, but still, dude, it's
But
great.
people are interested, though. I recently just switched over to Substack. I know you've been there.
I had to process this. That's my favorite new Substack name.
What's funny is I've been talking to multiple people, and then I talked to the Substack religion person, and it's been like a year of multiple friends saying like, you really should. And it wasn't until I had an idea for the title that I was like, all right, well, this would be fun.
That is fun.
It was both processing and then processing the topics. And
no, I laugh every time I see that. That cracks me up.
If you look at religion, this is the only data I see all the time now that I'm on, it tells you, because there's like 70-some thousand people on it. And so I always just think, there are all these people that are on here on an email list and want me to say things. And I do not do very many things that are directly towards normal people. It is intentionally nerdy and always been driven by I enjoy the intellectual questions. I kind of think it's cool when I end up changing my mind. It's a very different MO than a lot of kind of religious or theological content, because so many of them take defensive postures towards things. I'm excited on that. So people, that would be the easiest place, because all the other stuff ends up there. But if people were trying to follow or find things, I would go there, because also they're way nicer in comments and stuff on Substack.
They are. It's funny how each different platform kind of engenders a certain type of response. And right now, Substack is it's a really good spot. There's a lot of interaction. It's funny with me, man. It drives me crazy. I'll write something and then I can tell when it posts because I'll get 9 people who text me, which is great. I'll take the text, but I'm like, if you just put a comment, you could start a dialogue here, and that would probably help me on the actual Substack page, which is fine.
Mm-hmm.
You know, either way is fine, but it's a cool little platform. Anyhow, find Tripp on Substack, Homebrewed Theology, Christianity, Theology Beer Camp, search Eventbrite to get your tickets. Foster Frodo.
Theologybeer.camp is the website.
Theologybeer.camp. Yes, thank you.
Yeah.
And then I will see you in a couple weeks in the Tetons.
Oh, yeah.
That's
It's going to be fun.
I'm not going to talk about Blue Moon. Is that what I'm not talking about?
No. No
Cider.
Blue Moon.
I'm going to talk about American cider.
Too much residual sugar. That's
Too much residual sugar. Just like our theology. Yes, sir. Yes, sir. All right, buddy. Well, thanks so much. I'm going to hit stop, but don't leave me. I'll say goodbye offline. Peace.